The room didn't go silent when the truth walked in. It shattered, quietly, precisely, like glass no one heard break, but everyone felt under their feet. The ballroom of the Carrington Grand pulsed with low jazz and soft laughter, crystal glasses catching the glow of chandeliers that spilled gold across polished marble floors. And at the center of it all stood Ethan Cole, tall, composed. Every inch the man whose name built towers and closed deals worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. His tuxedo cut sharp against his frame, his voice measured and calm as he addressed a room full of investors, board members, and media figures who watched him like he was the future itself. Every camera angled just right. Every phone lifted subtly to capture a moment that would later become headlines. Because when Ethan Cole spoke, markets listened, and tonight was no different. His words about expansion and innovation rolling effortlessly, practiced, controlled, untouched by anything that resembled hesitation, until the moment something shifted, not in his voice, not in his posture, but somewhere deeper, something that didn't belong to the script or the lights or the applause waiting at the end of his sentence. Because across the room, near the edge where the glow faded into shadow, a small figure stood still, too still for a child in a place like this. A boy no older than 6, maybe 7, his hand hanging loosely at his side, his dark curls catching just enough light to outline his face. And it wasn't his presence that disrupted the rhythm of the room. It was the shape of his face, the quiet, unmistakable familiarity in the set of his eyes, the line of his jaw, the way he held himself with a stillness that didn't belong to someone so young. And Ethan's voice faltered, just for a fraction of a second, a pause so slight most wouldn't notice, but the cameras did, the ones trained to catch weakness, to replay it, to slow it down later and ask what changed, because something had, something undeniable, something that reached past the polished version of him and pressed against a memory he hadn't visited in years. The boy didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there as if the noise of the room had nothing to do with him. As if he existed in a space untouched by wealth or status or expectation, and Ethan's eyes locked on him without permission, drawn not by curiosity but by recognition, the kind that didn't need explanation, the kind that settled in the chest before the mind could catch up. And suddenly the music felt distant, the laughter hollow, the words in his speech meaningless, his next sentence dissolving on his tongue as his gaze stayed fixed, because the boy's eyes weren't just familiar. They were his, not similar, not close, but exact, like looking into a reflection that didn't belong in this room. And the realization didn't hit all at once. It unfolded slowly, dangerously, like a truth that had been waiting for the right moment to surface, the kind that didn't ask for permission before it changed everything. And then she stepped forward, not from the center of the room where attention was expected, but from the side, from the quiet spaces, where people like her moved without being seen. Amara Johnson, dressed in a simple uniform that marked her as staff, her posture straight, her expression calm, carrying a presence that didn't belong to the role she wore, her skin catching the light in a way that made her impossible to ignore once you saw her. And Ethan saw her, really saw her, for the first time in years, and the past didn't rush back in chaos. It returned in fragments, controlled, precise, a memory of a different space. A different time, a moment he had closed off and sealed away because it didn't fit the life he had chosen. And yet here she was, not asking, not explaining, just standing beside the boy as if that alone said everything that needed to be said. And the room began to notice the subtle shift in attention, the way conversations softened, the way heads turned not because they understood what was happening, but because they felt it, the tension that didn't belong to the event but now defined it. And Ethan's hand tightened slightly around the edge of the podium, the only outward sign that something inside him had shifted beyond control, his breath steady but heavier now, his thoughts no longer aligned with the words he was supposed to deliver, because none of this was supposed to exist in his world, not here, not now, not in front of an audience that measured everything in power and perception. And yet the boy took a small step forward, just enough to close the distance between himself and Amara, his fingers brushing against her hand in a gesture so natural it carried no awareness of the weight it held. And that was when it settled, not as a question, not as doubt, but as certainty, a truth so clear. It didn't need to be spoken. Ethan's world didn't collapse. It shifted, subtly but permanently, like a foundation that had just been revealed to be something else entirely. And for the first time in years, control slipped, not dramatically, not enough for the room to fully understand, but enough for him to feel it, to recognize that whatever came next wouldn't be dictated by contracts or strategy or influence, because standing in front of him was something none of those things could manage. A child who carried his face without ever having known his name, and a woman who stood beside that child with a quiet strength that made it clear she had never needed him to survive. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with the kind of truth that didn't ask to be acknowledged, only seen. And Ethan Cole, the man who controlled everything in every room he entered, stood there under the lights, realizing for the first time that this moment, this quiet, unplanned fracture, in his perfect narrative, was something he could neither predict nor undo. The applause came a second too late, scattered and uncertain, like a room trying to follow a rhythm that had already broken, and Ethan Cole did not bow his head or acknowledge it the way he normally would. He simply stood there with his gaze still fixed on the boy, his fingers resting against the podium as if it were the only solid thing left in the room. And for a moment no one spoke, no one moved, because something invisible had shifted in the air, something that turned a carefully orchestrated evening into a question no one knew how to ask. And then the sound returned all at once, glasses clinking, a cough from somewhere near the back. A whisper passed between two executives who leaned too close together, and Ethan stepped back from the microphone without finishing his sentence. A rare break in control that did not need explanation because the cameras had already captured it, the pause, the shift, the direction of his eyes, and they would replay it later, frame by frame, trying to understand what had pulled the most composed man in the room off script. But Ethan was no longer aware of them. His attention had narrowed to a single point, and that point was moving. Amara turning slightly, guiding the boy with a gentle pressure of her hand, as if she had already decided how this moment would end long before he understood it had begun. And she did not look at him again, not immediately, which somehow unsettled him more than if she had confronted him outright. Because her silence was not hesitation, it was distance, practiced and deliberate, the kind built over years. And Ethan moved, not quickly, not enough to draw attention, but with purpose, stepping down from the stage and into the crowd that parted for him automatically, people stepping aside without realizing why, their instincts responding to his presence even as his focus ignored them entirely. And the closer he got, the clearer it became, the boy's features resolving under the light in a way that erased any remaining doubt. The same line of the brow, the same slight tilt of the head, the same quiet intensity that had once been pointed out to him in boardrooms and interviews as if it were a mark of distinction, and now it stood in front of him in a form that made all of that feel irrelevant, because it did not belong to him alone. And Amara finally looked up, her eyes meeting his without flinch or hesitation, steady, grounded, untouched by the tension that surrounded them. And in that look there was no accusation, no plea, no need for explanation, only recognition, as if she had always known this moment would come and had already decided who she would be when it did. And Ethan stopped a few feet away, the distance small but absolute, a line drawn without words, and the noise of the room dimmed again, not because it actually faded but because his awareness of it did. His voice, when it came lower than usual, controlled but edged with something unfamiliar. "We need to talk," he said. The words simple, insufficient, and Amara's expression did not change. She glanced down briefly at the boy, then back at him, and for a second Ethan thought she might refuse, might turn and leave without giving him even that. But instead she nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, and turned toward a corridor at the side of the ballroom where the lights softened and the cameras did not reach as easily. And Ethan followed, aware now of the eyes that tracked them, the quiet curiosity that would grow into speculation before the night was over. But he did not stop, did not adjust his pace, because whatever this was, it had already crossed into something that could not be managed publicly. And the hallway felt different, cooler, quieter, the sound of the gala reduced to a distant hum behind closed doors. And Amara stopped near a service entrance where the light flickered slightly overhead, the kind of place meant to be passed through, not occupied, and she turned to face him fully, the boy stepping closer to her side. his small hand finding hers again, and Ethan noticed that, the instinctive way the child moved toward her, the way his body aligned with hers as if that was where safety existed, and it struck him with a force he was not prepared for. Because it was not something that could be argued or negotiated. It was simply there, built over time he had not been part of, and for a moment he did not speak, the question forming but refusing to come out in the controlled, precise way he was used to, and when it finally did it was quieter than expected, almost careful. Is he mine? And the words hung there, heavier than they should have been, because they were not just a question. They were an admission of everything that might follow, and Amara did not hesitate, did not soften it or build toward it. She answered the way she had lived, directly. He always was, and there was no anger in her tone, no edge meant to wound, just truth, steady and complete, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that did not release tension but acknowledged it, his gaze shifting briefly to the boy who was watching him now with a quiet curiosity, not fear, not recognition, just observation, as if he were trying to understand why this man mattered in a moment that already felt defined without him. And Ethan felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest, not guilt in the dramatic sense, not regret shaped into words, but something more immediate, more physical, the realization of absence, of years, that had existed without him and would not return. And he looked back at Amara, searching for something he could hold on to, a point of entry, a way to reframe what stood in front of him into something he could act on. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, and the question came out sharper than intended, not accusatory but edged with disbelief, because in his world information was always delivered, always managed, never left to chance, and Amara's expression shifted slightly then, not in emotion, but in clarity, as if she had expected that question and already knew her answer. "You were not there to tell," she said, her voice even, and Ethan's jaw tightened. "That is not an answer," he replied, and she held his gaze without stepping back. "It is the only one that matters," and the words landed with a weight that did not need emphasis, because they pointed to something he could not rewrite, a choice already made, a distance already established, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them not empty, but full of everything that did not need to be said. And then Ethan's focus shifted again, not to escape the moment, but to understand it, his eyes moving to the boy, studying him not as an abstract idea, but as a person, a presence, someone who had lived a life he had not seen. And he took a step closer, slow, deliberate, not wanting to startle or impose, and the boy watched him, his expression unchanged, his hand tightening slightly around Amara's fingers, and Ethan stopped, recognizing the boundary without needing it to be spoken, and something in that recognition shifted again, because for the first time in a long time, he was not the one setting the terms, he was the one learning them, and it unsettled him in a way no negotiation ever had, because there was no strategy for this, no leverage, no control, only the reality of what stood in front of him and the quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be decided by him alone. The silence in the hallway did not feel empty. It felt measured, like every second carried weight that neither of them was willing to waste, and Ethan remained where he stood, his gaze still fixed on the child who had not looked away, who had not hidden behind Amara or buried his face into her side the way most children might in front of a stranger, and that detail settled into Ethan's mind with quiet force. Because it was not just confidence, it was familiarity with standing without fear, the kind that came from being raised in truth, not illusion, and Ethan straightened slightly, not to reclaim control, but to steady himself inside a moment that refused to be shaped by his usual instincts. His voice, when it came again lower, more deliberate. "What is his name?" And Amara answered without hesitation, "Noah." And the name landed softly, but carried something deeper, something rooted, something that had existed long before this hallway, before this night, before his awareness of it. And Ethan repeated it once in his mind without saying it aloud, testing the way it felt against everything he thought he knew about his life, and nothing aligned the way it should have, because this was not a variable he had ever accounted for, not a possibility he had left room for, and yet it stood in front of him undeniable, complete, and he shifted his attention fully to the boy, lowering himself slightly, not enough to feel unnatural, but enough to remove the height that separated them, and Noah watched him with the same steady gaze, curious but guarded, his small hand still wrapped in Amara's. And Ethan spoke again, slower now, careful with each word, as if he understood for the first time that language carried more weight here than in any negotiation he had ever led. "Noah," he said, and the boy's expression flickered, not recognition but acknowledgement, as if hearing his name from this man carried a different meaning than it did from anyone else, and Ethan felt it, that shift, subtle but real, and he continued, "I am." But the sentence did not complete, not because he did not know the words, but because he realized in that instant that the title he might claim had not been earned, not in this space, not in front of this child, and the hesitation lingered just long enough for Amara to notice, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in judgment, but in clarity, as if she understood exactly what had stopped him, and Ethan straightened again, exhaling slowly, the weight of that unfinished sentence settling into him with a precision he was not used to, and he turned back to her, his voice firmer now, searching for structure in a moment that resisted it. "We need to figure out what happens next," and Amara's expression did not change, but there was a shift in her stance, a grounding, as if this was the part she had already prepared for, the part where he would try to define terms, to move forward in a way that made sense to him, and she responded calmly, "There is nothing to figure out," and Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in disbelief. "That is not realistic," he replied, his tone controlled but edged with the logic that had built his world. "This changes things," and Amara met his gaze without stepping back. "It changes things for you," she said, and the distinction settled heavily between them, because it was true in a way that could not be argued. Noah had already lived a life, already formed a world that did not include him, and Ethan felt that realization press against the edges of his certainty, not breaking it, but shifting it, forcing him to see the limitations of a perspective that had always centered on his own influence. And he glanced again at the boy, who was now watching both of them, his eyes moving between their faces as if trying to understand a conversation that did not include him, but clearly involved him more than anyone else. And Ethan stepped slightly to the side, adjusting his position not to assert himself, but to be seen more clearly, and he spoke again, this time directly to Noah, his voice softer, stripped of the authority that usually defined it. "Do you know who I am?" And Noah hesitated, not out of fear but out of thought, his brows pulling together slightly as he considered the question, and then he shook his head once, simple, honest, and the answer landed harder than anything Amara had said, because it was not layered with meaning or defense, it was just truth, unfiltered and complete, and Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing it, not reacting outwardly, but feeling the shift internally, the understanding that whatever role he might claim here would not come with recognition, not automatically, not without time. And he looked back at Amara, searching her face for something that might guide him through this, a signal, a boundary, anything that defined the space he was now standing in, and she held his gaze steadily, her voice even. "He does not need to know tonight." And there was no hesitation in her tone, no uncertainty, just a decision already made. And Ethan opened his mouth to respond, to challenge, to assert a different timeline. But something stopped him, not hesitation this time but awareness, the recognition that pushing here would not give him what he wanted, it would only reinforce the distance already in place. And he closed his mouth again, nodding once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the boundary she had set, and the moment stretched, quiet but charged, until a distant sound from the ballroom filtered back into the hallway, a reminder that the world he had stepped out of was still waiting, still moving, still unaware of the full weight of what had just shifted, and Ethan straightened fully now, his posture returning but not his certainty, and he spoke again, more controlled, more deliberate. "I am not walking away from this." And Amara's expression softened just slightly, not in acceptance but in recognition of the statement, and she replied calmly, "You already did once." And the words did not rise in volume, did not carry accusation, but they landed with a finality that no raised voice could match, because they were rooted in fact, in history, in something that had already happened and could not be undone. And Ethan did not respond immediately, because there was no response that could erase that truth, and for the first time in a long time he allowed the silence to exist without filling it, standing there in a space that was no longer defined by his control, but by something far more precise, something that demanded patience, accountability, and a willingness to stand still long enough to understand what had already been built without him. The hallway light flickered once more, a faint hum settling into the quiet as if the building itself recognized that something had shifted beyond its polished walls, and Ethan remained still for a moment longer after Amara's last words, not because he had nothing to say, but because for the first time he understood that speaking too quickly would only prove her right, that he had once walked away without understanding the weight of that decision, and now every word carried the burden of not repeating it, and he drew a slow breath, steadying himself in a way that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with restraint. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, stripped of the authority that usually shaped it. "I am here now." And the statement was simple, almost understated, but it did not try to erase what had already been said, and Amara watched him carefully, her gaze searching not for confidence, but for consistency, as if she had learned long ago that presence meant nothing without proof. And she did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to test the space between them. And in that silence, Noah shifted slightly, his fingers loosening from her hand just enough to adjust his stance, his attention moving from Ethan back to his mother, as if checking for guidance without asking for it. And Amara's hand rested lightly against his shoulder, a small, grounding gesture that spoke more clearly than any explanation, and Ethan noticed it. The ease, the familiarity, the quiet language between them that did not require words, and it pressed against him with a realization that was both sharp and steady. This was not a space he could enter simply by claiming it. It was something that had been built over years of presence, of consistency, of showing up in moments no one else saw. And for a brief second his gaze dropped, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement of that truth. And when he looked up again, there was something different in his expression, not softer, not weaker, but more precise, more aware of the boundaries he was stepping into. And he spoke again, this time not to Amara but to Noah, his tone careful, measured. "You have been here all night." And the boy nodded once, his expression calm. "Mom works here sometimes," he said, his voice quiet but clear, and Ethan felt the words settle into him. Mom, spoken with ease, with certainty, a title earned and reinforced through time, and he nodded slowly, processing the simplicity of it. "Do you like it here?" he asked, not because the answer mattered in a practical sense, but because he was searching for a way to understand the life that had existed without him, and Noah shrugged slightly, glancing up at Amara before answering. "It is okay, there is a lot of noise," and Ethan almost smiled at that, a small, fleeting shift that disappeared as quickly as it came, because even that detail carried meaning. The difference between a world that thrived on noise and one that endured it. And Amara stepped in then, her voice steady. "We should go," she said, not as a suggestion but as a decision, and Ethan's attention snapped back to her, the instinct to respond immediate. "Wait," he said, not raising his voice but adding just enough urgency to stop her movement, and she paused, not turning fully back to him but not walking away either, and the line between them held, thin but unbroken, and Ethan took a step forward, careful not to close the distance too quickly, his words coming slower now, more deliberate. "I am not asking you to change everything tonight," he said, choosing each word with intention, "but I am asking for a chance to be part of his life." And the request hung there, not dramatic, not desperate, but real in a way that could not be dismissed as easily as his earlier statements. And Amara turned then, fully facing him again, her expression unchanged but her eyes sharper, more focused, as if she was weighing not just the words but the man behind them, and she responded after a moment, her voice calm. "A chance is not something you ask for. It is something you show you deserve." And Ethan absorbed that without interruption, nodding slightly, because there was no argument that could dismantle it, no logic that could replace the simplicity of what she had just said, and he exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to show that he understood the terms had shifted, and he glanced once more at Noah, who was now watching him again, his curiosity still present but his body angled slightly toward Amara as if ready to move with her at any moment. And Ethan spoke one more time, this time directly to the boy, his voice steady. "I would like to see you again. and Noah did not answer immediately, his eyes moving to Amara again, seeking something unspoken, and she gave the smallest nod, barely noticeable, but enough, and Noah looked back at Ethan, his expression thoughtful. Maybe, he said, and the word was small, uncertain, but it carried more weight than any agreement Ethan had ever secured in a boardroom, because it was not guaranteed, it was not controlled, it was simply possible, and Ethan nodded once, accepting it for what it was, not pushing for more, not trying to shape it into certainty. And Amara turned then, her hand finding Noah's again, her posture calm, unhurried, and she began to walk toward the exit of the hallway, not looking back, not pausing to see if Ethan would follow, because that was not her role anymore. And Ethan stood where he was, watching them go, the distance between them growing not in steps but in meaning, and for the first time in years he did not try to close it immediately, did not reach for control or solution, he simply stood there, allowing the moment to exist as it was, incomplete, unresolved, and entirely outside of his command, and behind him the sound of the ballroom swelled again, louder now, brighter, as if nothing had changed, but Ethan knew better, because something had. Something that would not be undone by time or silence or distance. Something that had already begun to redefine everything he thought he understood about power, presence, and what it meant to truly show up. The ballroom lights felt harsher when Ethan stepped back inside. Not because they had changed, but because he had. The gold glow now too bright against a truth that refused to soften under it. And the sound of conversation rushed back around him like a tide that had been waiting just outside the door. Executives resuming their low conversations, glasses lifted, laughter carefully measured, but beneath it all there was a shift, subtle yet unmistakable, the kind that spread without needing explanation. Because people had seen enough to know something had happened, and Ethan moved through them without stopping, without acknowledging the greetings that would normally anchor him to the center of the room, his focus distant, his steps deliberate, as if the space he had just left still held him in place. And behind him the hallway door closed quietly, sealing off the moment that had just unfolded, but not its impact. And across the room a few eyes followed him more closely now, noticing the difference in his expression, the absence of his usual composure. And someone near the bar lowered their voice just enough to pass a question that would become speculation before the night ended. But Ethan did not hear it, or if he did, it did not register. Because his mind was no longer operating in the patterns that had defined it for years, it was moving differently now, slower in some ways, sharper in others, replaying details that did not fit neatly into any framework he understood. The way Noah had stood without fear, the way Amara had spoken without hesitation, the way neither of them had looked to him for permission or approval, and he reached the edge of the stage again, pausing briefly as if considering whether to return, to pick up where he had left off, to restore the image that everyone in the room expected, but the thought passed quickly, because he understood now that nothing he said on that stage would matter in the way it had before, not tonight, and he turned, instead toward the side exit, ignoring the event coordinator who stepped forward with a polite smile and a question ready on her lips, her voice trailing off as she realized he was not stopping, and outside the night air met him with a cool clarity that the ballroom could not offer, the city lights stretching out beyond the entrance, steady, indifferent, and for a moment he stood there, just outside the doors, his shoulders easing slightly, as if the weight of the room had finally lifted, and he exhaled slowly, the breath deeper than the ones he had taken inside, and he reached into his pocket for his phone, the movement automatic, a reflex built on years of solving problems through action, through information, through control, and he paused with it in his hand, the screen dark, reflecting back a version of himself that felt less certain than it had only an hour before, and he unlocked it anyway, scrolling through contacts, through names that represented solutions, strategies, outcomes, and none of them felt relevant, not in the way they normally would, because this was not a situation that could be managed through delegation or precision. It was something else entirely, something that required presence in a way he had never practiced, and he lowered the phone again, slipping it back into his pocket without making a call, and across the street a car passed, headlights cutting briefly through the space before fading again, and Ethan's gaze followed it for a moment before returning to the entrance behind him, his mind already shifting forward, not to escape what had happened, but to face what it meant. Because for the first time in years, there was something in his life that he could not reduce to a decision point, something that would not resolve with a signature or a meeting, and he straightened, the familiar posture returning not as a mask, but as a foundation, something to stand on rather than hide behind. And he stepped away from the entrance, moving toward the curb where his driver waited, the black sedan idling quietly under the streetlight, and the driver stepped out immediately, opening the door with practiced efficiency. But Ethan did not get in right away. He stopped beside the car, his hand resting lightly against the frame, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the street. And for a moment he allowed the silence to stretch again, not filling it, not escaping it, just letting it exist. And then he spoke, not loudly, not as an order, but as a statement that carried intention. Find out where she lives. And the driver hesitated just slightly, not because the request was unclear, but because the tone was different, less detached, more deliberate, and he nodded once. Yes, sir. And Ethan added after a brief pause, his voice steady, discreetly. And the word carried weight, not as a strategy, but as a boundary, a recognition that this was not something to be exposed or managed publicly. And the driver nodded again, stepping back, and Ethan finally moved, sliding into the back seat, the door closing with a soft, final sound that separated him from the street. And as the car pulled away, the city lights blurred slightly against the glass, shifting from sharp lines into something softer, less defined, and Ethan leaned back into the seat, his gaze unfocused, but his thoughts sharper than they had been all night. And he saw it now more clearly, not just the moment in the hallway, not just the recognition, but the years that had led to it, the absence that had shaped something he was only beginning to understand. And he realized that whatever came next would not be about reclaiming something lost. It would be about earning something that had never been his to begin with. And the car moved through the city with quiet precision, passing buildings that bore his influence, deals that carried his signature, a life built on control and certainty. And for the first time, it all felt slightly removed, not meaningless, but incomplete, as if something essential had existed just outside of it all along, waiting for the moment he would finally see it. And as the car turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city softened, the lights thinning out, and Ethan closed his eyes briefly, not to rest but to steady himself against the shift that had already begun, because he understood now that this was not a moment that would pass. It was a beginning, quiet, unexpected, and entirely outside the life he had planned. And when he opened his eyes again, there was no hesitation left in them, only focus, not the kind that controlled outcomes, but the kind that committed to them, no matter how long it took. The city had quieted by the time the car came to a stop. The hum of late-night traffic softened into something distant and unimportant, and Ethan stepped out onto the pavement without waiting for the driver to circle around, the door closing behind him with a muted sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. And for a moment he stood outside his building, the glass tower rising above him in perfect symmetry, every light aligned, every reflection clean, a structure built on precision and control. And yet tonight it felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. And as he walked through the revolving doors, the lobby greeted him with the same polished silence it always did, marble floors stretching wide, soft lighting reflecting off steel and glass, the front desk attendant straightening immediately, offering a respectful nod. But Ethan did not slow, did not acknowledge it beyond a brief glance, his steps carrying him toward the elevators with a focus that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with something far more personal. And as the doors closed around him, the reflection of his own image stared back, sharp, composed, unchanged on the surface, but his eyes lingered on it longer than usual, searching for something beneath that exterior, something that explained the shift he could feel, but not yet fully define. And the elevator began its ascent, smooth, uninterrupted, the numbers rising steadily, and with each floor the distance between him and the moment at the gala grew physically but not mentally, because it remained there, precise, detailed, impossible to ignore, the way Noah had said maybe, not yes, not no, just a possibility that carried more weight than certainty ever could. And the doors opened to the penthouse level, the space beyond expansive and quiet, city lights stretching across the windows like a distant constellation, and Ethan stepped inside, the door closing behind him, sealing him into a world that had always been his, a world where everything existed exactly as it should, and yet tonight it felt incomplete, as if something essential had been missing all along and he had only just realized it. And he moved through the space without turning on additional lights, allowing the city glow to fill the room instead. His steps slower now, less driven by habit and more by thought, and he stopped near the window, looking out over the skyline, the familiar view offering no answers, only reflection, and for a moment he stood there in silence, not reaching for his phone, not calling anyone, just letting the weight of the night settle into something clearer, something that could not be ignored or postponed. And behind him the quiet of the penthouse felt deeper than usual, not peaceful but empty in a way he had never noticed before, and he turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room, the clean lines, the expensive details, the absence of anything that carried personal history beyond his own, and that realization landed differently now, sharper, more defined, because for the first time he understood what was not there, what had never been there. And he exhaled slowly, the breath steady but heavy, and crossed the room to the desk where files and documents were arranged with perfect order, untouched since earlier that evening, and he rested his hand against the surface, grounding himself not in the work, but in the reality that this space, this life, had been built without consideration for anything beyond control and outcome. And now there was something that existed entirely outside of that structure, something that could not be organized or predicted, and he reached for a drawer, opening it with a quiet motion, his eyes scanning the contents not for a specific item, but for something that might anchor him to the past. And he found it after a moment, a photograph tucked between documents, older, slightly worn at the edges, a version of himself from years ago standing beside a woman whose presence he had not allowed himself to revisit until now. And he held it for a second longer than necessary, his gaze fixed on the details he had once dismissed as irrelevant, the way she had looked at the camera, not posed, not trying to impress, just present. And he felt something shift again, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady, like a realization that had been waiting beneath the surface. And he closed the drawer slowly, placing the photograph back exactly where it had been, not because it belonged there, but because he understood now that the past could not be altered, only acknowledged. And he stepped away from the desk, moving back toward the window, his reflection merging with the city lights beyond, and his phone buzzed quietly in his pocket, breaking the silence with a reminder of the world that still expected him to operate as he always had. And he pulled it out, glancing at the screen where a message from his driver appeared, short, precise, an address, and Ethan read it once, then again, committing it to memory not as information but as direction, and he slipped the phone back into his pocket, his gaze returning to the skyline. But now it was different, no longer distant or detached, because somewhere within it existed a place that held something real, something that did not belong to his world yet but had always existed without it. And he stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching around him, no longer empty but filled with intention. And when he finally moved, it was with a clarity that had not been there before, his steps purposeful, not rushed, as he turned away from the window and headed toward the door, not toward rest, not toward routine, but toward something he could no longer ignore, something that would require more than presence, more than words, something that would demand time, consistency, and a willingness to stand outside of everything he had built until he understood how to be part of something he had never learned to hold. And as the door closed behind him, the penthouse remained exactly as it was, unchanged, controlled, complete in every way except the one that now mattered most. The address sat in his mind with a clarity that did not fade with distance. And by the time the car turned onto a quieter street far from the polished glass towers of downtown, Ethan had already understood that this part of the city did not bend to his presence the way boardrooms and offices did, the buildings lower, older, their edges softened by time rather than design. Streetlights casting a warmer, dimmer glow that did not demand attention but simply existed. And when the car slowed to a stop in front of a modest apartment building, Ethan did not move right away, his gaze fixed on the entrance as if measuring something that could not be calculated. And the driver stepped out, opening the door, but Ethan lifted a hand slightly, signaling him to wait, because this moment did not feel like one that could be entered with the same ease as every other space he had. Controlled, and after a second he stepped out on his own. The night air cooler here, quieter, carrying the distant sound of a television through an open window, the faint laughter of someone unseen, details that felt foreign not because they were unfamiliar, but because they had never belonged to his world. And he approached the building slowly, not hesitating but aware, each step carrying a weight that had nothing to do with distance and everything to do with what waited beyond the door. And when he reached it, he paused, his hand hovering for a fraction of a second before pushing it open. The hallway inside narrow, softly lit, the scent of something warm lingering in the air, and he moved forward, the sound of his shoes quieter here, absorbed by worn carpet. And he found the apartment number easily, the one that had been sent to him without explanation. And for a moment he stood there, not knocking, not announcing himself, just standing in front of a door that separated two lives that had never been meant to meet again. And he raised his hand finally, knocking once, firm but not forceful, the sound carrying through the space behind it. And a few seconds passed, long enough to feel, short enough to expect, and then the lock turned, the door opening just enough for Amara to see who stood there, her expression unchanged from earlier, calm, steady, unsurprised, as if she had known this would happen even if she had not known when. And Ethan met her gaze, not speaking. Immediately, allowing the moment to settle between them without forcing it forward, and she opened the door slightly wider, not as an invitation but as acknowledgement, stepping back just enough to create space. Without stepping aside completely, and he did not move until she did, understanding now that entry here was not automatic, it was allowed. And when he stepped inside, the difference was immediate, the space smaller, lived in, filled with details that did not match his world but felt complete in a way his never had. A couch with a folded blanket draped across the arm, a small table with books stacked neatly, a pair of shoes by the door that were clearly Noah's, and the sound of a television playing softly from another room. And Ethan's eyes moved across it all, not with judgment, but with recognition, because this was what life looked like when it was built through presence rather than design. And he turned back to Amara, his voice quieter now. "I did not want to wait," he said, the words simple but carrying intention, and she studied him for a moment before responding. "You are not the only one who does not wait." And there was no hostility in her tone, only truth, and Ethan nodded slightly, accepting it. And from the other room Noah appeared, pausing in the doorway when he saw Ethan, his expression shifting from curiosity to something more measured, not fear, not discomfort, but awareness. And he stepped closer, stopping beside Amara, his hand resting lightly against her arm as if grounding himself. And Ethan lowered himself slightly again, meeting the boy at a more equal level, his voice steady. "Hi, Noah." And the boy watched him for a moment before answering. "Hi," his tone neutral, open but cautious, and Ethan allowed that to exist without trying to change it, because he understood now that trust here was not given through words, it was built slowly. And he stood again, his attention returning to Amara. "I meant what I said," he continued. "I am not walking away from this." And she held his gaze, her expression unchanged. "Words are easy," she replied. And Ethan did not argue, did not defend. He simply nodded, because she was right, and the acknowledgement mattered more than any explanation he could offer. And a silence settled again, not uncomfortable but deliberate, as if both of them were measuring what came next without rushing to define it. And Ethan glanced around the apartment once more, the small details anchoring him in a reality he had never considered before. And he spoke again, this time more carefully. "What does he like?" And the question was simple, almost ordinary, but it carried a shift, a move away from control and toward understanding. And Amara's expression softened slightly, not in acceptance but in recognition of the change. And she answered, "He likes drawing, and he reads more than most children his age." And Ethan nodded, absorbing it, committing it to memory not as information but as connection. And Noah watched them both, his gaze moving between them as if trying to place himself within a conversation that had not yet included him fully. And Ethan looked back at him, his voice quieter now. "Do you want to show me?" And the question hung there, open, without pressure. And Noah hesitated, glancing up at Amara again. And she gave the smallest nod, the same one from earlier, and the boy turned, walking toward the other room without speaking, and Ethan followed, not too close, not too far, aware of every step, every movement. Because this was not a space he could enter without care, and when he reached the room, he saw the drawings spread across a small desk, paper filled with careful lines, colors chosen with intention, and he paused, taking it in, understanding in that moment that this was not just about being present. It was about learning how to see, how to notice what had been there all along without him, and behind him Amara stood in the doorway, watching, not interfering, not guiding, just observing. Because this was the beginning of something she would not control for him, something he would have to earn one moment at a time. The room felt smaller once he stepped fully inside it, not because of its size, but because every detail carried meaning that he did not yet understand, and Ethan stood near the desk for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze moving over the drawings spread across its surface, lines and colors that were not careless or rushed but deliberate, each one holding a kind of focus that made it clear Noah did not draw to pass time. He drew to express something, and Ethan reached out slowly, picking up one of the pages with a careful motion, as if he understood instinctively that this was not something to handle without respect, and the drawing showed a skyline, tall buildings under a wide sky, the shapes slightly uneven but recognizable, and he paused, studying it, noticing the details that did not belong to a child's imagination alone, the way certain windows were marked brighter than others, the way one building stood slightly apart from the rest, taller, more defined, and he recognized it, not immediately, but with a quiet realization that settled as he looked closer. It was one of his buildings, not perfectly rendered but clear enough to identify, and that detail landed with a weight he had not expected, because it meant that even without knowing him, Noah had seen his world, had noticed it, had translated it into something personal, and Ethan lowered the page slightly, glancing toward the boy who now stood beside him, watching his reaction without speaking, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the silence not empty, but full of understanding that had not yet found words, and Ethan finally spoke, his voice quieter, more grounded. "You drew this," and Noah nodded once, his expression steady. "I see it from the bus," he said, and Ethan felt something shift again, the image forming in his mind, a small figure sitting by a window, looking up at a skyline that had always belonged to him, unaware of the connection that existed beyond sight. And he placed the drawing back carefully, not wanting to disrupt the order it had been placed in, and he looked at the other pages, each one different, some filled with color, others more precise, buildings, streets, people, small moments captured in ways that suggested attention to detail beyond his years, and Ethan realized then that this was not just about learning what Noah liked. It was about understanding how he saw the world, how he processed it, how he existed within it, and he turned slightly, his gaze shifting back to Amara, who remained in the doorway, her posture relaxed but attentive, watching without interrupting, and Ethan spoke again, this time directed toward her. "He pays attention." And she nodded once. "He always has," she replied, and there was something in her tone that carried both pride and quiet acknowledgement of the work it took to nurture that kind of awareness, and Ethan absorbed that, recognizing that these qualities did not exist in isolation. They were shaped, guided, reinforced over time, and his gaze returned to Noah, who had moved to the small chair near the desk, sitting down with a kind of ease that came from familiarity, and Ethan hesitated for a moment before lowering himself into the chair beside him, the movement slower, more deliberate than usual, because he understood now that proximity here was not automatic. It had to be earned through care, and he looked at the boy again, his voice steady. "Do you draw every day?" And Noah shrugged slightly, picking up a pencil without looking at it. "When I have time," he said, and Ethan nodded, understanding that even in that simple answer there was structure, a routine, shaped by responsibilities he had not been part of, and he leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his posture open, not imposing. "What do you like to draw the most?" he asked, and Noah considered the question for a moment, his pencil moving lightly against the paper as if thinking through the answer visually rather than verbally, and then he said, "Things that stay." And Ethan's brows pulled together slightly, not in confusion but in curiosity. "Things that stay," he repeated, and Noah nodded, still focused on the page. Buildings, places, things that do not go away. And the words settled into the room with a quiet significance that did not need explanation, and Ethan felt it. The underlying meaning, the value placed on permanence, on stability, on things that did not disappear, and he glanced briefly toward Amara again, understanding without asking that this perspective had been shaped by more than preference. It had been shaped by experience, by absence, by learning to hold on to what remained when other things did not. And he turned back to Noah, his voice softer now. "That makes sense," he said, and the acknowledgement was simple but genuine, and Noah looked up at him then, just for a moment, as if assessing whether the understanding was real or just spoken, and then he looked back down, continuing his drawing without comment, and Ethan allowed that to be enough, not pushing for more, not trying to force connection where it had not yet formed naturally, and the room settled into a quiet rhythm, the soft sound of pencil against paper, the distant hum of the television in the other room, the subtle presence of Amara in the doorway, and Ethan realized that this was what it meant to be present without control, to exist in a moment without shaping it, to observe without directing. And it was unfamiliar in a way that was both unsettling and grounding, because it required something he had not practiced, patience without expectation, and after a few minutes Noah set the pencil down, turning the paper slightly so Ethan could see it. A new drawing forming, simpler than the others, but more focused, two figures standing near a building, one smaller, one taller, the lines not detailed but clear in their intention, and Ethan studied it for a moment, recognizing the outline of the building again, recognizing the difference in the figures, and he looked at Noah, his voice quiet. "Who are they?" And Noah hesitated, not immediately answering, his eyes flicking briefly toward Amara before returning to the page, and then he said, "I do not know yet," and the answer hung there, open, unfinished, and Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that not everything needed to be defined immediately, that some things were still forming, still finding their shape, and he sat back slightly, giving the boy space, his gaze lingering on the drawing just a moment longer before shifting back to the room around them. And in that moment, he understood that this was not about stepping into a role, it was about allowing it to take shape over time, one moment, one interaction, one quiet acknowledgement at a time, and for the first time since the night had begun, the urgency that had driven him here softened, replaced by something steadier, something that did not demand immediate resolution but committed to presence, to consistency, to staying, even when the outcome was not yet clear. The pencil rested between Noah's fingers for a moment longer before he set it down completely, the quiet scratch of graphite fading into the soft hum of the apartment, and Ethan remained seated beside him, his gaze still fixed on the unfinished drawing, the two figures standing near the building, undefined, waiting for meaning, and something about that image lingered longer than the others, not because it was more detailed, but because it was not, because it held space for something that had not yet been decided. And Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair, giving the boy room without stepping away, his presence steady but careful, and the silence that followed did not feel uncertain, it felt intentional, like a pause that allowed something to settle rather than force it forward. And after a few seconds Noah stood up, moving past him toward the small shelf against the wall, his movements natural, unguarded, and Ethan watched without interrupting, observing the rhythm of a life he had never seen before. The way the boy reached for a book without hesitation, the way he flipped it open to a marked page, as if continuing something that had already been in motion long before Ethan arrived. And he realized then that this was not a moment where everything paused to accommodate him. This was a life that continued with or without his presence, and that understanding shifted something deeper, grounding him in a way that no boardroom ever had. And Amara stepped slightly closer into the room, her arms crossing loosely as she leaned against the doorframe, not closing the distance but no longer standing entirely apart, her gaze moving between them, measured, aware, and Ethan glanced toward her briefly before returning his attention to Noah, his voice low, steady. "What are you reading?" And Noah held the book up slightly without turning around completely. "It is about cities," he said, and Ethan nodded, not surprised, because it aligned with everything he had seen so far. The focus, the attention to things that remained, and he stood slowly, the movement deliberate, careful not to disrupt the quiet balance of the moment, and he stepped closer, just enough to see. The pages, diagrams of buildings, streets, structures drawn with clarity and precision, and he felt a faint recognition again, not of the book itself, but of the mindset it represented, the need to understand how things were built, how they held together, and for a moment he wondered if that part came from him, if something had carried through even without his presence, and the thought did not settle as pride. It settled as responsibility, something he had not been there to guide but now understood he could not ignore, and Noah turned a page carefully, his finger tracing a line along one of the diagrams, and Ethan watched that small movement, the focus, the patience, and he spoke again, more thoughtfully this time. "Do you want to build something like this one day?" And Noah paused, considering the question, his fingers still resting against the page, and then he shrugged slightly. "Maybe, or maybe something different," he said. And Ethan felt a small shift at that answer, not disappointment, but awareness, because the future here was not something he could define or direct. It was something Noah would choose on his own, and that realization held a quiet clarity that he did not resist, and he nodded once, accepting it without trying to shape it into something else. And Amara's voice broke the silence then, calm, grounded. "It is getting late," she said, not as a dismissal, but as a reminder of the structure that existed beyond this moment. And Noah closed the book. Without argument, setting it back on the shelf with care, his routine uninterrupted by Ethan's presence, and Ethan stepped back slightly, giving them space as the rhythm of the evening shifted, and Noah moved toward the small hallway, pausing just once to look back at Ethan, not with hesitation but with quiet acknowledgement, and then he disappeared into the next room, the sound of a door closing softly behind him, and the apartment grew still again, the absence of his presence noticeable in a way that felt immediate, and Ethan turned back to Amara, the distance between them no longer defined by the same tension as before, but still carrying weight, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence. Different now, not confrontational, not uncertain, but reflective, as if both of them were measuring what had just happened without needing to explain it, and Ethan finally broke it, his voice steady. "He is," but the words stopped, not because he did not know how to finish the sentence, but because no single word felt sufficient, and Amara watched him, her expression softening just slightly. "He is himself," she said, and the answer was simple, complete, leaving no space for anything else to be added, and Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing it, understanding that whatever parts of him might exist in Noah did not define him. They were only pieces of something larger, something shaped by years Ethan had not been part of, and he exhaled quietly, the breath carrying a sense of grounding that had not been there before, and he stepped toward the door, not abruptly, not as an exit, but as a recognition that this moment had reached its natural end, and he paused there, turning back once more, his gaze meeting Amara's. "I will come back," he said, not as a promise meant to persuade, but as a statement of intention, and she held his gaze for a moment before nodding once, not granting permission, not offering approval, just acknowledging that the decision was his to follow through on, and Ethan opened the door, stepping out into the hallway, the quiet of the apartment giving way to the softer, more distant sounds of the building, and as the door closed behind him, he remained there for a second, his hand still resting lightly against the handle, the weight of what had just happened settling into something clearer, something that no longer felt like a disruption but like a beginning, and he stepped away then, moving down the hallway with a steadier pace, not rushed, not uncertain, because for the first time since that night had begun he understood that this was not about a single moment. It was about everything that would come after, the choices, the consistency, the presence, that would need to be shown again and again without expectation of immediate return, and as he reached the building exit and stepped back into the night air, the city felt different, not smaller, not less significant, but more connected to something he had only just begun to see, and he walked toward the waiting car without looking back, not because the moment was over, but because it was no longer something he needed to chase. It was something he had committed to, something that would require him to return not once, but continuously, until the space between what had been and what could be was no longer defined by absence, but by presence earned over time. The drive back felt longer than it should have, not because of distance but because of the silence that filled it, a silence that no longer felt empty but carried weight, intention, and something unfamiliar that did not belong to the rhythm Ethan had lived by for years. And when the car finally pulled up to the glass tower again, the building stood exactly as it always had, tall, flawless, reflecting the city lights with precision. But this time it did not feel like a destination, it felt like a place he was passing through. And he stepped out without waiting, his movement steady, his focus already shifting beyond the structure behind him. And as he entered the lobby, the same polished calm greeted him, the same quiet acknowledgement from the front desk, but none of it held his attention the way it once had, because something had changed in how he moved through these spaces, something that could not be reversed by stepping back into routine, and the elevator ride up felt different well, not because of the motion, but because of the thoughts that followed him, the image of Noah sitting at that small desk, the way he had said things that stay, the way his hand had moved with certainty across paper that did not need approval, and Ethan found himself replaying those moments with a level of focus he usually reserved for critical decisions. Except this time, there was no strategy forming, no immediate plan, only understanding slowly taking shape. And when the doors opened and he stepped into the penthouse again, the quiet space greeted him the same way it always had, controlled, perfect, untouched, but now it felt less like completion and more like contrast, a space that had been built entirely around one perspective, one life, one set of priorities, and he moved through it without turning on additional lights, the city glow stretching across the floor, and he stopped again near the window, his reflection faint against the glass, layered over the skyline beyond. And for a moment he stood there, not reaching for anything, not distracting himself, just letting the stillness settle. And then his phone buzzed again, pulling his attention back just enough to remind him that the world he had built was still moving forward, still expecting decisions, responses, control. And he pulled it out, scanning the messages quickly, meetings rescheduled, questions from his executive team, a request for clarification on something he had left unfinished at the gala, and he stared at the screen for a second longer than usual, his thumb hovering over a response before lowering the phone again, because none of it felt immediate anymore, not in the way it had only hours before, and he set the phone down on the table without replying, a small shift that would have been unthinkable before, and he moved away from the window, crossing the room with a purpose that was no longer tied to routine, and he stopped at the desk again, looking at the clean, untouched surface, the documents waiting exactly where he had left them, and for a moment he simply stood there. Then he reached for one of the folders, opening it slowly, scanning the contents without truly seeing them, because his mind was elsewhere, not disengaged, but redirected, and he closed the folder again, setting it down with a quiet finality that did not signal neglect, but reprioritization, and he leaned back slightly against the desk, his gaze drifting again, this time not outward toward the city, but inward, toward something that had not existed in his awareness until now. And he realized then that everything he had built, every decision, every structure, had been shaped by control, by certainty, by outcomes that could be measured and predicted. And now there was something entirely outside of that, something that could not be forced into alignment, something that required time in a way he had never respected before, and the realization did not frustrate him, it grounded him, because for the first time he understood the difference between influence and presence, and he pushed himself away from the desk, walking toward the kitchen area, pouring a glass of water without thinking, the simple action steadying in its familiarity, and he stood there for a moment, the glass in his hand, the quiet surrounding him, and he thought about Noah again, not just the drawings or the book, but the way he had looked at him, not with recognition, not with expectation, but with openness that had not yet been shaped by disappointment or trust. And Ethan understood that what stood in front of him was not something to reclaim, it was something to build, and that process would not follow the rules he was used to, it would not move at his pace, it would not respond to pressure, it would only respond to consistency, to showing up without expectation. And he set the glass down slowly, the sound soft against the counter, and he turned back toward the window, his reflection still faint against the glass. But now it felt less like something to examine and more like something to align, and he reached for his phone again, not to respond to the messages waiting, but to open his calendar, scrolling through the days ahead, the meetings, the commitments, the structure of a life that had always been tightly controlled, and he paused, then began to adjust it, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but deliberately, creating space where there had been none, time that could not be replaced by anything else. And when he finished, he set the phone down again, the action quiet but definitive, because it marked a shift that would not be undone by convenience or habit. And he stood there for a long moment after that, the city lights stretching out beyond him, unchanged, constant. And for the first time, they did not represent everything he had built. They represented something he was beginning to step away from, not to abandon it, but to understand it in relation to something that mattered more. And as the night settled deeper around him, the silence in the penthouse no longer felt empty. It felt intentional. A space that would no longer remain untouched. A space that would have to change if he was going to become someone who did not just build things that stood tall, but built something that stayed. Morning did not arrive with urgency. It unfolded slowly through the glass walls of the penthouse, the first light of day stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines that carried none of the pressure Ethan was used to waking up to. And for the first time in years, he did not reach for his phone the moment his eyes opened. He did not scan for missed messages or overnight changes. He simply lay there for a second longer than usual, aware of the stillness, aware of the shift that had not faded, with sleep but settled deeper, more defined. And when he finally stood and moved through his routine, it was precise but no longer automatic, each action grounded in thought rather than habit. And by the time he reached the kitchen, pouring his coffee with the same measured motion he had performed thousands of times, his mind was not on the day ahead in the way it used to be. It was already moving towards something else, something outside of the calendar he had adjusted the night before. And as he stepped into his office space, the city fully awake now beyond the windows, his phone buzzed again, the steady return of expectation, and this time he picked it up, scanning the messages with clarity, responding where necessary, directing where needed. But there was a difference in how he moved through it, no longer pulled into every detail, no longer anchored by the need to control every outcome. And when his assistant's voice came through with a reminder of a meeting he had already shifted, Ethan paused, then replied calmly, "Reschedule it for next week." And the response carried no hesitation, no justification, just a decision that reflected a new priority. And there was a brief silence on the other end before acknowledgement, a small shift that would ripple through a system used to his constant availability. But Ethan did not dwell on it. He set the phone down again and turned toward the window, the skyline sharp in the morning light, the same buildings, the same structures, but now, each one carried a different weight, because he understood that somewhere beyond them, beyond the reach of his influence, was a space that did not respond to power or timing. And he stepped away from the desk, moving with intention, the decision already made before the day had fully begun. And within the hour he was back in the car, the route different this time, not toward offices or meetings, but toward a quieter part of the city that had already begun to settle into his awareness. And as the car moved through traffic, the pace slower now with morning commuters, Ethan did not rush it. He did not push for efficiency. He allowed the time to exist, to separate this moment from the one before it. And when the car turned onto the familiar street, the same buildings rising into view, the same warm light reflecting off windows that had nothing to do with design and everything to do with life, he felt the same grounding presence as the night before, but clearer now, more intentional. And when the car stopped, he stepped out immediately, no hesitation, no pause, and approached the building with a steadier sense of purpose, the door opening easily, the hallway unchanged. And when he reached the apartment, he knocked once again, the sound firm but measured, and this time the response came quicker, the door opening to reveal Amara, her expression calm but more guarded than the night before, as if she had spent the time since then considering what this meant, not just for herself, but for Noah. And Ethan met her gaze without speaking immediately, allowing the moment to settle before stepping forward. And she held the door in place, not blocking him, not inviting him, simply standing there as if waiting for him to define his purpose clearly this time. And he did, his voice steady. "I said I would come back." And she studied him for a moment, then stepped aside just enough to allow him in, not fully, not comfortably, but enough. And Ethan entered, the apartment feeling more familiar now, not in ownership but in awareness. and he noticed the small changes, a different book on the table, a cup set near the sink, signs of a life that continued regardless of his presence. And Noah appeared from the hallway again, dressed for school, a small backpack slung over one shoulder, his expression shifting slightly when he saw Ethan, not surprised, but more attentive, as if yesterday had created a reference point that he was now building on, and Ethan lowered himself slightly again, meeting him at eye level. "Good morning, Noah," he said, and the boy responded with a small nod. "Good morning," his tone quiet but clear, and Ethan noticed the difference, subtle but real, a shift from uncertainty to recognition, and he stood again, his attention returning to Amara. "I can drive him," he said, the offer direct, simple, and the words hung there for a moment, not as a demand but as a possibility, and Amara's expression did not change immediately, her gaze moving briefly to Noah, then back to Ethan, measuring not just the offer but the intention behind it, and she shook her head once, gently but firmly. "He takes the bus," she said, and the response was not dismissive. It was grounded, a continuation of the structure that already existed, and Ethan nodded, accepting it without resistance, because he understood now that change here would not come through replacing what worked, it would come through becoming part of it, and he shifted slightly, adjusting his approach. "Then I will walk with him," he said, and this time Amara paused longer, considering it, not because the request was unreasonable, but because it carried a different weight, a step into their routine rather than over it. And after a moment she nodded once, not fully agreeing, not fully denying, just allowing the possibility to exist, and Noah looked between them, his expression thoughtful, then adjusted his backpack slightly. "We should go," he said, and the simplicity of it settled the moment, and Ethan stepped back toward the door, giving them space to lead, not moving ahead, not taking control. And as they stepped out into the hallway together, the dynamic shifted again, subtle, but significant, three figures moving through a space that had never included all of them before. And when they reached the street, the morning light brighter now, the sounds of the city more active, Ethan fell into step beside Noah, not too close, not distant, matching his pace naturally. And for the first time the path forward did not feel like something he needed to define. It felt like something he needed to follow, one step at a time, until presence itself became something that did not need to be proven, only continued. The sidewalk stretched ahead in a quiet line of early morning routine, the kind of ordinary rhythm that rarely left an impression on people who were always moving past it. But Ethan felt every step of it now, the sound of shoes against concrete, the distant hum of cars passing by, the soft murmur of conversations from people heading toward their own destinations, and beside him Noah walked at a steady pace, his backpack resting comfortably against his shoulders, his gaze forward but aware, not avoiding Ethan's presence but not leaning into it either, simply existing within the space they now shared. And Amara walked on the other side, her posture relaxed but attentive, her presence steady, as if she was not watching every movement but was aware of all of them at once. And Ethan matched their pace naturally, not adjusting it to fit his own rhythm, but allowing himself to move within theirs. And for a moment none of them spoke. The silence not awkward, not heavy, but new, something that had not yet found its shape. And Ethan let it remain, resisting the instinct to fill it, because he understood now that words here carried weight that could not be rushed. And as they approached the bus stop, a small group of people already waiting, children shifting their weight, parents exchanging brief nods before the day pulled them in different directions, Ethan slowed slightly, recognizing that this was a point of transition, a place where his presence might not yet fully belong, and Noah stepped forward a little, adjusting his backpack again, his attention moving to the approaching bus in the distance, and Ethan glanced at him, then spoke quietly. "What is your favorite class?" The question simple, grounded, and Noah considered it for a moment before answering. "Art," he said, without hesitation, and Ethan nodded, a small acknowledgement that did not try to turn the moment into something larger, and he added after a second, "That makes sense." And Noah looked at him briefly, not surprised, but as if measuring whether the understanding was real, and then he nodded once, returning his gaze to the street, and Amara watched the exchange from the side, her expression unreadable but present, and the bus pulled closer, the sound of its brakes soft but distinct, and as it came to a stop, the doors opening with a familiar motion, Noah stepped forward without hesitation, turning just slightly before boarding, his eyes meeting Amara's first, then Ethan's, and he gave a small nod, not formal, not forced, just a quiet acknowledgement of presence, and Ethan returned it. The gesture simple but steady, and then Noah turned and stepped onto the bus, disappearing into the line of seats and movement, and the doors closed again, the bus pulling away with a low hum, carrying him forward into a day that would continue whether Ethan was part of it or not. And Ethan stood there for a moment after it left, his gaze following it until it turned the corner and was gone, and the space beside him felt different now, not empty, but defined by absence in a way that carried meaning, and he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and turned slightly toward Amara, who remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her gaze no longer on the bus but on him, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them not uncertain but reflective, as if both of them were acknowledging what had just happened without needing to define it. And Ethan spoke first, his voice calm. "Thank you." And the words were simple, but they carried a weight that did not need explanation, and Amara held his gaze for a second before responding. "This is not about me," she said, and Ethan nodded, because he understood that, not as a dismissal, but as a reminder of what mattered, and they began to walk again, not back toward the apartment immediately, but along the sidewalk, the direction unspoken but shared, and Ethan matched her pace again, the rhythm familiar now in a way it had not been before, and after a few steps he spoke again, more measured this time. "I will keep showing up," and the statement was not offered as reassurance, not framed as a promise meant to persuade. It was simply stated, grounded in intention rather than expectation, and Amara did not respond right away, her gaze forward, her steps steady, and after a moment she said, "Then show up without expecting it to change everything right away." And Ethan nodded, the understanding immediate, because he had already begun to see that, already begun to accept that this process would not follow the pace he was used to, and they continued walking in silence for a few seconds, the morning light shifting slightly as the sun rose higher, casting longer shadows across the pavement, and Ethan glanced at the buildings around them, the small details he had missed before now more visible, the way a window was left open just enough to let in the air, the way a neighbor paused on a doorstep to adjust a bag before heading out, the way life here moved without needing to be managed, and he realized that this was not just about being present for Noah. It was about understanding the environment that had shaped him, the space that had supported him, and he looked back at Amara, his voice quieter now. "You built this," he said, not referring to the apartment alone, but to everything it represented, and she stopped walking then, turning to face him fully, her expression calm but firm. "I did not build it alone," she said, and the words carried a quiet truth that did not need expansion, and Ethan held her gaze, understanding that this was not a story of absence alone. It was a story of presence, of effort, of choices made without him, and he nodded once, accepting it without trying to shift it, and they resumed walking, the distance between them no longer defined by tension, but by something more balanced, something that allowed space without separation, and as they reached the building again, Amara stopped at the entrance, turning slightly toward him, and Ethan paused as well, the moment settling into a natural close, and she spoke once more, her voice steady. "Do not come back because you feel guilty." And Ethan met her gaze, his response immediate but calm. "I am not here because of guilt," he said, and there was no hesitation in his tone, no need to justify, just clarity, and she studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once, not in full agreement, but in acknowledgement of what he had said, and she turned, stepping inside the building without looking back, and Ethan remained where he was for a second, the morning lights steady around him, the sounds of the city continuing without pause. And he understood then that this was what progress looked like, not a dramatic shift, not a resolution, but a series of small moments that carried meaning because they were consistent, because they were real. And he turned away from the entrance, stepping back onto the sidewalk with a steadier sense of direction, not toward control, not toward resolution, but toward continuation, toward the quiet, deliberate act of showing up again, not because it would fix everything, but because it was the only way anything could truly begin to change. The day did not end with a single moment. It unfolded across small, quiet returns that built something steady without announcing it. And over the next few days, Ethan came back again, not with urgency, not with demands, but with the same measured presence that had begun to define him, arriving at the same hour each morning, walking the same stretch of sidewalk, standing at the same bus stop where routine did not shift to accommodate him, but slowly made room for him. And Noah noticed at first not through words, but through consistency. The way Ethan was there again without needing to explain why. The way he matched his pace without trying to lead. The way his questions remained simple, grounded, never pushing beyond what was offered. And on the third morning, Noah spoke first, his voice quiet but clear. "You came back again." And Ethan nodded, not turning it into something larger. "I said I would," he replied. And Noah looked at him for a second longer than usual, not testing, not doubting, just observing. And then he nodded once, accepting it without comment, and the bus arrived the same way it always did, the same sound of brakes, the same opening of doors, but the moment before it felt different now, not because of what was said, but because of what no longer needed to be. And as Noah stepped onto the bus, he paused just slightly, his gaze moving to Ethan before turning forward. And that small pause carried more meaning than any question could have, because it was not uncertainty anymore. It was awareness, and Ethan stood there until the bus disappeared again. The same motion, the same quiet into the moment, but this time it did not feel like absence. It felt like continuation, and Amara watched it all from the side, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. But there was a shift in her gaze now, not in trust, not yet, but in recognition of effort that did not fade after a single day. And as they walked back toward the building, the silence between them carried less weight, less resistance. And when Ethan spoke, his voice calm. "I can adjust my schedule in the afternoons," he said, not offering details, not explaining his life, just stating a possibility. And Amara listened without interrupting, her steps even, and after a moment she replied, "He has art club on Tuesdays." And the words were simple, but they were more than information. They were a door left slightly open, and Ethan nodded once, understanding what it meant without asking for more. And the next week came with the same rhythm, the same mornings, the same quiet walks. And when Tuesday arrived, Ethan did not need to be reminded. He was already there, standing near the school as the afternoon light softened across the building, students filtering out in small groups, laughter and conversation blending into the air. And when Noah stepped out, his eyes found Ethan without searching, the recognition immediate, and he walked over without hesitation, his backpack slightly heavier now, his expression the same steady calm, and Ethan greeted him with a small nod. "How was it?" he asked, and Noah lifted a folder slightly. "We worked on perspective," he said, and Ethan glanced at it, understanding the word not just as a concept, but as something that had already begun to shift in his own life. And as they walked back together, the space between them no longer uncertain, Noah began to speak more, not all at once, not in long explanations, but in small pieces, fragments of his day, details about what he saw, what he noticed, what he thought about when he drew. And Ethan listened, not interrupting, not redirecting, just absorbing it, allowing the conversation to form naturally without shaping it. And Amara walked beside them, her presence steady as always, but her attention less guarded now, her gaze moving between them not to monitor, but to understand what was taking shape. And when they reached the apartment again, Noah did not go straight inside. He paused at the door, turning slightly toward Ethan, and for a second the moment held, quiet, simple, and then Noah spoke. "You can come tomorrow too." And the words were not framed as permission, not offered as a condition. They were just said, as if it had already been decided somewhere between the first step and this one. And Ethan nodded, the response immediate but calm. "I will," he said, and there was no need to add anything more, because the meaning was already there. And Noah turned, stepping inside, the door closing behind him with the same soft sound as before, and Ethan remained there for a moment, the air still, the street unchanged, but something within it had shifted, something that did not rely on status or control or expectation, something that existed because it had been built slowly, through presence, through patience, through showing up when there was no guarantee of return. And Amara stood beside him for a second longer before speaking, her voice quiet but clear. He does not offer that easily. And Ethan met her gaze, understanding the weight behind her words, not as a warning, but as a truth, and he nodded once. I know, he replied, and the acknowledgement did not carry pride. It carried respect, and she studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod, not in full acceptance, not yet, but in recognition of what had been done, and she turned, stepping back inside, leaving the door open just long enough for the moment to settle before closing it. And Ethan stood there a second longer, the city moving around him in the same steady rhythm. But now it felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had found something within it that mattered more than anything he had built before, something that could not be measured or controlled, only earned. And as he turned to leave, his steps steady, his direction clear, he understood that this was not an ending, not a resolution, but a beginning that would continue long after this moment passed, one that would require the same quiet commitment, the same consistency, the same willingness to stand where he had once been absent, until presence itself became something that no longer needed to be proven, only lived.